You'd like to turn in your Bibles with me. We're going to go to the 139th Psalm this morning. 139th Psalm. If you have a really, really good memory, all the way back to November 2023, you can check out because that's when I preached this message last. But I'm counting on the fact most of you don't remember anything I said on that day back in November of 2023. And the reason being for that, obviously, with some extra snow removal stuff this morning. One of the things when we get to canceling services, or I know a lot of people might be missing, and I'm doing a series. It's hard for me to just go ahead and tear through with the series when I think a lot of folks, I'm not sure how many's going to be there to do it. So I made a decision a couple of hours ago to pull something old out and go through that, and we'll pick up next week with our James series and it really is starting a new section, so it's a fine time to take a little bit of a break. We'll be starting James chapter 2 next week. But Psalm 39, as I look through some stuff, is what I felt like might be really good and encouraging for us to look at today. It's a great psalm. One thing back up I was going to share with you too, a handful of you would appreciate the fact Becca and I were able to go down to Greenville for Pastor Netting's funeral this last week. That went really well, about an hour-long service, which is fitting. He liked long messages and things like that, so if you remember and have that kind of a memory. Trying to think, we really knew next to anybody. Brent and Heidi were down there as well, and we knew Sherilyn. That was about it. We had a chance to smile and wave at Cindy Doers when she walked by at one point, but didn't have any conversations with her. It was a pretty tight-knit, even as far as Becca and I, we were just able to go to the service. As far as the graveside meal and everything, that was all just tight family stuff that they did. But a lot of the family was down there. It was a good service, so neat to at least represent us and be able to let them know Sherilyn was enormously grateful and thankful that we had come down for it. But, that had us out of town most of the week too, so that was another part of getting us to where we are today. It's just been a crazy week with all kinds of different things going on and stuff like that. But Psalm 139, I'm going to read the entire psalm. A lot of times I'll just read part of a psalm, but this psalm is so beautifully put together in the way David has written it. I just want to take the opportunity to read it through, and then we'll talk about the parts and pieces of it as we sort of work our way through it for our message this morning. 139th Psalm says, O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from afar. You search out my path and my lying down and are acquainted with all my ways. Even before a word is on my tongue, behold, O Lord, you know it altogether. You hem me in behind and before and lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high. I cannot attain it. Where shall I go from your spirit? Or where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the utmost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, and the light about me be night, even the darkness is not dark to you. The night is bright as the day, for darkness is as light with you. For you formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there were none of them. How precious to me are your thoughts, O God. How vast is the sum of them. If I would count them, they are more than the sand. I awake, and I am still with you. Oh, that you would slay the wicked, O God. O men of blood, depart from me. They speak against you with malicious intent. Your enemies take your name in vain. Do I not hate those who hate you, O Lord? And do I not loathe those who rise up against you? I hate them with complete hatred. I count them my enemies. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts, and see if there be any grievous way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. Let's go ahead and have a word of prayer. Father, we do again thank you for the day that you've given us. Father, I thank you for this opportunity to be together. Father, the weather may change, things may get difficult, regular routines may get thrown out of whack, but Father, we thank you that we simply have the ability to gather together as a group of believers, to sing some hymns that remind us of who you are, of your love for us, of your care for us, to spend some time in the truth of your word. And Father, that's all you ask of us. I pray that you'd bless this time this morning. As I've already prayed, Father, may it not only be an honor and a glory to you as it reminds us of the great and awesome God that you are. Father, may this time in your word also be an encouragement to our hearts. May it remind us of who you are, of our relationship with you. And Father, I pray that in your wisdom, through the power of your Spirit, the truth of your word would accomplish your work in each and every life that's here this morning. And we'll thank you and praise you for it in Christ's name. Amen. There's so many bits and pieces to this psalm. And to be honest with you, there's about 4 or 5 major sections as we sort of interpret it and take it apart and look at what David's doing. But one of the sections that maybe gives us a little bit of help when it comes to interpreting it and understanding what's going on is down in verse 19. If we jump down there real quick, and I know I've read the whole thing, but in verse 19, we get a little bit of an insight probably of something going on in David's life at this point. And he shares with God, "Oh, that you would slay the wicked, O God, men of blood, depart from me. They speak against you with malicious intent. Your enemies take your name in vain. Do I not hate those who hate you, O Lord? Do I not loathe those who rise up against you? I hate them with complete hatred. I count them my enemies." Clearly, and we know this is true with most of David's life, to be honest with you, but clearly part of what he's drawing out here in these verses is a context of being hurt by others. And not just hurt by others, but when he writes, they speak against you with malicious intent. Your enemies take your name in vain. Clearly, David's saying that in the sense of, they're against God, and he sees and understands that. But I think most of us get the fact that when David's saying they're against God, it's because he's probably experienced it firsthand himself. And people have been after him. And as they've come after him, as they've come after his God, he clearly is taking it very personally. But most often, even in our life, when somebody goes against God to us directly, it's usually directed at us. And I don't think that's probably any different with what David is going on here. So we see this fact that he understands the pressing and overwhelming nature of a wicked world, a world against God. And I think that's probably the context when we look at it that helps us see and understand the best application for this psalm. When we start to look at these parts and pieces. Because to be honest with you, most of this psalm doesn't have anything in the context of the wicked and those that hate God and things like that. Most of this psalm is about each believer and their relationship with God. That's what David's doing here. It's a beautiful, poetic expression of David and who his God is and what his God means to him personally. But I wanted to start by pointing out that idea of a context because I think it's significant in the fact that many of us, when we, most of us live, or have lived or understood the idea of being hurt by others. All of us live in a world that is growingly antagonistic towards God. It's just as far as our society in general, God is either going to be totally ignored, he's going to be made fun of. If you're known as someone who, particularly identifies with God, we don't have a lot of super blatant persecution with it, but it's more and more growing the fact that you're just sort of dismissed. You're just sort of like, oh, you're one of those crazy church-going nuts, It's sort of like, oh, really? People say things like, oh, I didn't know you were that serious about religion, when they sort of hear you say something about Christ or church or, God forbid you mention something about believing in creation or something like that. And it's like, whoa, wait a minute. I didn't realize, you were that wacko when it comes to your faith and things. It's the world we live in. And living in a world like that, and I don't think this is really going to change much, when it comes to believers, will bring increasing pressure. It will mean that we will go through things in life that will be more and more difficult when it comes to how we're treated, when it comes to maybe circumstances. And I, honestly, I hope it doesn't get to that point, but we do have biblical examples where when people named the name of Christ, when early churches were being planted, and I think of Paul's letters and some of the things we've looked at there, it was not uncommon for believers to be separated from families, to have family tension come up, to have believers have issues with jobs, and all of a sudden they couldn't get jobs, or people wouldn't buy stuff from them, and whatever, trade they're practicing. I mean, there could be financial repercussions, family repercussions. And the reality of the fact is, when we face those things, and it may not even be from an antagonistic world, maybe just family issues and problems, but the fact that we're a believer comes into play. What David does here is he gives us an insight to a relationship he has with God that is so deep and so significant that it is truly an amazing source of encouragement for him. Even if he's in a point in life where, like in those verses, he's talking about the wicked, he's talking about men of blood, he's talking about those who go against God with malicious intent. Even if we find ourselves in a very similar kind of scenario. And yeah, he expresses there his love for God, his commitment, I'm on your side, and that's a lot of what this paragraph's doing. But even in the most hostile of environments, the reality of that relationship with God is what's so significant here. So as we work our way through it and we get started on it, one of the first things we see, and like I said, there's about 4 or 5 main sections here as we're going to break it down this morning. The first one's the first 6 verses that really illustrates the fact that you are always on the mind of God. As one of God's children, as someone who is called on the name of Christ, you have that relationship with God. What David is rehearsing here is the fact that we're always on the mind of God. This illustrates an extensive, thorough, and personal relationship. It's sort of interesting. Sometimes in the loneliest times in your life, I don't know if you've experienced it before. Not a lot, but I have seen it before. You ever been in a room full of people and you feel like you're absolutely alone? And when you really start to analyze that, it's why? Because you're in that room full of people or whatever the scenario is, and either you don't know anybody really well, or nobody's talking to you, or nobody seems to care about what's going on, or there's just so much disinterest or disconnect with whatever's going on. And there's a lot of different scenarios that can get us there, but the point I'm trying to get at is that feeling of the fact that as humans, there can seriously be points in our life where we can be surrounded by people and feel absolutely alone and like nobody gets us. Nobody understands it. Nobody sees. And sometimes that's just because we're human. I've known people that I've been close to before, and they've expressed feelings like that, and it kills me inside because I know that I am not disinterested or I do not care about them, but I clearly, because I'm human and I don't do things 100% perfect all the time, I've not conveyed it like I ought to, And that's something we always ought to work on to let the folks close to us know that that's the way we feel about them. But the reality is sometimes, and I think most of us get to those points. And what David's doing here is he's saying, look, here's God, and here's this amazing thing about him. I'm always on his mind. He always sees, he always understands. As he starts it out here, O Lord, you have searched me and known me. When he says, O Lord, and sprinkled throughout these first 6 verses, we see a lot of the use of you and I. He says me and my. It's a very serious, very personal thing here. You have searched out my path and my lying down, my tongue. Your hand is upon me, This is David and his God. That's who he's talking about here. And it's reverence when he says, "O Lord." In that first verse, he says, "You've searched me and known me." The idea of search there is the idea of scrutinizing something closely, testing it. Technically, literally, the word means to dig. You go to the depths of something. I used this illustration a couple weeks ago, and it was a different word, but the meaning is very similar. When I talked about a little kid when they see, a bug on a sidewalk or something, and they just got to stop and boom, and write down. I was holding Rosie yesterday, and she had one of her favorite stuffed animals, and there was a little spot on it. And it's like all of a sudden she just stopped. And she stared intently, and she got really close, and she had to reach down and grab it and get it. And she's sitting there going, bug, bug, bug. And it's like, no, it's not a bug. Which I was sort of impressed, because if she thought it was a bug, she still reached out and grabbed it. So I thought, well, that's cool. But, what was she doing? There's that scrutiny. There's that in-depth. There's that. This is not a mild observation, in other words. When David is talking about his God and the fact that he has searched me, and then as we continue this idea that he has known me, this idea is the fact that, and it becomes a major theme of the entire psalm in all honesty, is the fact that God knows us. Our thoughts, our activities, our direction, our words. He's going to come back to this theme throughout this entire psalm. And the understanding or the thing that he draws out about the fact that God has searched him and known him is the fact that God knows everything there is to know about him. Inside and out. Forwards, backwards, upside down, whatever the case might be. Every detail of the daily routine, every unspoken thought. I mean, when you look at verse 2, you know when I sit down, you know when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from afar. You search out my path and my lying down, and are acquainted with all my ways. Even before a word is on my tongue, behold, O Lord, you know it altogether. You hem me in behind and before, and lay your hand on me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high. I cannot attain it. What David's doing in like verse 2, even all the way down through verse 4, is he's filling in the blank for us. When he says, God has searched me and known me, he said, here's what I'm talking about. He says, my God knows me so well. I mean, it's a deep knowledge. It's scientific. I mean, he has dug down to the inner depths, obviously better than any other person could understand him. He's saying this is what, he knows when I'm sitting down, he knows when I rise up. That talks about the activity there. And the whole meaning in Hebrew poetry, when you use, two opposite descriptions like that, sitting down or rising up. What that meant is not just to talk about the two actions of, okay, so God's marked in a book somewhere every time I sit down somewhere, and every time I get up, he's marked it. No, what it means is sitting down, getting up, and any activity between the two all day long. That's what the Hebrew poetry expresses in it. He's saying all of my activity. You discern my thoughts from afar. I mean, that's amazing. That's knowledge that only God can have. How thankful we are that there's no one else around us that can discern all of our thoughts from afar. But God can, and he does, and David takes comfort in that. You search out my path and my lying down. He says, I made the comment, this week's been one of those weeks where different things come up and plans keep changing and things are different. And sometimes, I can get frustrated by that. I like to be able to know what the plan is and things like that. David's saying, God, you know my path. For us, we don't have a clue. There's going to be bends in the road. There's going to be obstacles. There's going to be things that we never saw coming. God's got it. He sees it. He knows it. He understands. As far as the lying down, he knows where we're going to be resting at. He knows exactly where the day is taking it. And he is acquainted. He has that knowledge of all of our ways. And then the idea of our speech. Even before a word is on my tongue, he says, behold, O Lord, you know it altogether. In our study in James, what we just talked about not long ago is that use of the tongue. And how James gives us those warnings to guard that and to make sure that we are proper. And he will come back to that several times in the letter. But the amazing thing David says here is, God, you know what I'm going to say before I even say it. And the problem that gets us in trouble with our tongues is the fact that a lot of times we say things before we even think about it, and that's the way our brain works. God knowed it. I mean, he was there. He knew exactly what was going to happen. And David's just painting this picture of a God that knows us so well, better actually than what we even know ourselves. It's a tremendous source of encouragement. When we get down to the last verse in this section, such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high. I cannot attain it. When David thinks these things about God and God's ability to search him and know him, one of the things I want to emphasize when we go through this today, it's not a negative thing for David. I've heard parts of this psalm, and to be honest with you, the notes that I preached just 2 years ago have some really negative parts in them. Because I've heard the psalm preached before, and sometimes it's just sort of the nature of our independent, fundamental, believing kind of backgrounds that a lot of time, and I can remember how I've heard the psalm preached before, it's a bunch of teenagers, and it's like God sees and knows everything you're thinking and everything you're doing, and if you don't get it right, he's going to, hit you in the head with a 2x4 or something. He's going to get you. And it brings this negative context into it. Now, true, God sees and knows everything we're thinking, good and bad. And I'm not going to say biblically that doesn't give us pause and reason to consider our behavior. That's a good thing. We're getting ready to do something that we know sinful and God wouldn't agree with. To stop and think, God sees, God knows, that sometimes can be a wonderful deterrent. And that's not a bad thing. But you know what? I don't think David's really talking about that here. Because when he gets to this verse 6, what the heart is of it, such knowledge is too wonderful for me, as high I cannot attain it. He's saying it's incomprehensible. It's marvelous. He's relishing in the fact that he has a God that knows him and knows him far better than he even knows himself. Far beyond our own comprehension, far beyond our understanding of our cause, of our purpose sometimes, of why we say what we say, God knows it. He sees our heart. He understands exactly who we are. And that's going to come down a lot here. That identity, who we are. The thing we often struggle to figure out most of our life, God knows. And he's got it. And David celebrates that. It's something that he rejoices in. When he says it's so high, it's too wonderful, I cannot attain it. He said it's far beyond my ability. But he's taking great encouragement and great comfort in the fact that there is a sovereign God who, when it comes to his life, knows every single detail. And that's an encouragement. As he continues in verse 7 down through verse 12, he talks about the fact that we're always in the presence of God. And I'm going to read that again. Where shall I go from your spirit? Where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend up into heaven, you're there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you're there. If I take wings of the morning and dwell in the utmost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, and the light about me be night, even the darkness is not dark to you. The night is bright as the day, for darkness is as light with you. So see, in this next sort of section or paragraph, David sort of switches. He's talked about God's intimate knowledge of him, God's wonderful knowledge of every aspect of his activity, of his thinking, of everything. And now he shifts to another aspect of God, and he said, God, your presence is everywhere. And the reminder, the application for David in that, we see right at the beginning where he's saying, where do I go? How do I get away from you, God? And the understood answer is, I cannot get away from you. And that's what he begins to do here. Poetically, he's just reminding, he's expressing the idea, he's using his creative mind to say, how could I get away from God? If I didn't want to be in the presence of God, how could I get away from it? Where do I go from your presence? You know, these are all rhetorical questions. A rhetorical question is a question that has an obvious answer. And a lot of times they don't print out that obvious answer. We're sort of meant to fill that in. Where shall I go from your spirit? The obvious answer, nowhere. And that's going to be the way he continues through here. Where shall I flee from your presence? Nowhere. There's nowhere I can go. As creative as I want to get, there's absolutely nowhere that I can get away from God. God is all-encompassing. He is all-present. And there's just this description here as we see David playing it out. And again, it's not with negativity. It's joy and awesome wonder at the incredible presence of God in his life. That's what he's rehearsing here. Okay? Again, what's the context? The context is being in a world that maybe isn't friendly to God, to opposition, to being hurt by others. And one of the greatest encouragements, because you know what? There were obviously times in David's life where he felt pretty alone. He's got family that's trying to take over his throne. Even before he become king, you know, God tells him, I'm going to make you king. And he thinks everybody ought to be happy about that. But Saul says, I'll kill you. And chasing him around, he's having to hide in caves and do all kinds of stuff. There were a lot of times where David probably felt very, very alone. But he's reminding himself and had learned to take amazing comfort and encouragement by the fact that he's saying, but you know what? No matter where life leads me, God knows and sees the path, and it will never be away from him. He knows my ways. He knows the thoughts. He knows exactly where I'm going to lay down and sleep. He knows exactly where this day is going to take me. And he said, though I may not know it, though, I take great comfort in the fact that God does know it, and wherever it is, there's not a place on the face of this earth that it's going to be away from him. That's how he rehearses it. So I can go up into heaven, you're there. You know, make my bed in Sheol, in the grave. You are there. Take the wings of the morning, dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea. Even there your hand shall lead, and your right hand shall hold me. And that's an amazing, that's pretty cool insight there. Because what is David doing? He's helping us see and understand what the presence of God means to him. He's saying, because the fact that I can never get away from you, look at what else he can never get away from. He'll never get away from God's hand leading him and his hand holding him. The direction of God, the protection of God. He says, I'll never be away from it. Whether he's trying or whether circumstances are driving him out of the normal routines or whatever the case is, he's just saying, God, you are everywhere. And in being everywhere, you'll always be able to direct me. You'll always be able to hold me. You'll always be there to protect me. You'll always be there to care for me, to provide for me. I mean, and when you even think of that idea of God's hand leading him and your right hand holding him, you can go back and think of Psalm 23 and that beautiful, shepherd psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, and he just, in understanding, a life that David knew very, very well, what it meant to take care of sheep and what it meant to be a good shepherd. He just so beautifully in the 23rd Psalm goes through and says, that's who God is to me. He's able to lead me to those green pastures. He's able to get me to those still waters, providing the food, the resource, the nourishment, a place to lay down and sleep. And he said, even when it gets to those valleys of the shadow of death, God will comfort him. He'll protect him. And that really is just another beautiful, more full description of what he's saying in verse 10 there. Your hand will lead me. Your right hand shall hold me. But as he continues in verse 11, it's interesting. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, and the light about me be night, even darkness is not dark to you, night is as bright as the day, for darkness is as light with you. He sort of switches from location here to the idea of a condition of the location, but it's still with the presence of God. The presence of God is everywhere, but he said, so I get to this place, though, and what I'm convinced is the fact that all light's going to go away, and it's going to be darkness. He said, one of the amazing things about your presence, God, though, is you don't know the darkness. Darkness is like light to you. This is sort of pulls from those first 6 verses because God knows everything. He sees everything. He's got it all down. There's nothing outside the comprehension and the knowledge of God. But he says, when I'm afraid because in the presence that I'm in, when I'm in that spot in my life, that it feels like it's nothing but darkness all around me, he said, for you, God, it's light. What's the great comfort and encouragement of that? Well, where does his protection and direction come from? He's just rejoiced in the fact that God will always direct him. God will always protect him. He'll always lead him. He'll always hold on to him. And the cool thing about these next couple of verses is even if wherever that path leads David and the presence is so dark, he has no concept of what's going on, God does. And God's the one that's going to lead him. God's the one that's going to protect him and hold on to him. Because there is no such thing as darkness to God. It's such an amazing truth when you think about it. Because we truly do get to points in our life sometimes, and hopefully they're not very common, but sometimes we get to points in our life where it all seems like darkness. And we can't see, if we had to direct or figure out where our path is leading to, we can't even begin to think what the day is going to look like because we don't know about the next few steps. Because we're either so hurt or confused or just muddled with, life and all the curses or whatever the case might be. Because it really fits with any and all scenarios that life can throw at us. We don't need to fear that. Because he said, it can be all darkness to me, God, but you're light. And there is no such thing as darkness to you. And you're the one that's leading me. You're the one that's protecting me. It's so amazing. As we move to the next section, not only does God know everything about us, not only is he always there with us, but we are intentionally and carefully created by God. This is where David gets really personal just as far as him, and it's true for each and every one of us. We just insert our name. But if we look at where David sort of moves next, because I think 13 down through 18 is the next sort of section that we look at, and this is where David specifically starts to talk about himself. For you formed my inward parts. Again, this is tied with the knowledge of God, even all the way back to verse 1, but it gets far more detailed. You formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them. How precious to me are your thoughts, O God. How vast is the sum of them. If you would count them, they are more than the sand. I awake, I am still with you. He wraps up that paragraph again with a reminder of the presence of God, which he's talked about. He can never get away from him. And it's such an encouragement because every time he wakes up, God's there with him. He knows it, absolutely guaranteed. But the detail that he goes into here about who he is before God and who God has made him to be, it is really just an absolute, and I know I've said this several times, it's just a beautiful piece of poetry. But more than just a beautiful piece of poetry, it's this amazing poetical insight. And this is some deep thinking here, where David has really wrestled through who he is before God. And what does he come up with? He's come up with the fact that every aspect of not just his life, which he sort of covered with the thoughts, the activities, the presence, all that stuff he's sort of gone over before. But he's saying every aspect of what? Of who I am. Every aspect of what makes me tick. And that's more than just thoughts here when we look at it. This is physical, this is spiritual, this is mental, this is everything. He said, God made me that way. Now, he again cuts to the end here. He sort of cuts to the chase, and we don't wonder what David's thinking about that. In verse 14, he says, I praise you. I praise you for I am, and two very familiar words in this psalm, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. The idea of fearfully means with reverence and awe. The idea wonderfully is something that's striking, it's remarkable, it is outside of human comprehension. So we really got to park on that a little bit. Because David is praising God. Hey, just straight up say, what motivates his praise? What motivates his praise is that when he thinks of his life, when he thinks of who he is, his identity is a word you could put. There's no real good word that puts with it, in all honesty, because so much of it is, like I said, it's physical, it's mental, it's spiritual. Every aspect of who he is, he said, is a what? A result of God creating me, of making me. That God who, everything else has been while David's alive. You've searched me, you've known me, my words, my activities, my thoughts. God, you see them, you know them. It's so wonderful, it's so amazing. But David now goes back before he was even born. And that's how he rehearses it here. You formed my inward parts. So everything about how he's done. And I love to read this psalm of the fact, I think a wonderful application of that is, he's talking about thoughts, but you know what? He's talking about his liver. Maybe we don't think of it that way, but he's talking about his liver, he's talking about his heart, he's talking about the bones that God gave him. He's talking about every bit and piece of who he is. You formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. Then he rehearses that praise. Why? Because that forming that God did of his inward parts, that knitting together, that craft work, and that's exactly what, I used to love building models growing up. The big rage now, even with some older folks in our church, I've heard them talking about are Lego kits, and you get 50 million pieces and you got to put them all together and hopefully you follow the instructions. I'm sure some don't, but it's that idea. Just every little bit and piece with every bit of fine detail. He's saying, God, that's exactly what you've done. And when God does that, he said, it's fearful, it's wonderful. He said, it is absolutely amazing. And he said, I praise you for that, God. My frame, wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written every one of them. David, and we don't know a lot from Scripture with this, but I think it's safe to say because David was human, and we understand what it means to be human in the sense of all of our parts secretly made and intricately woven together and everything inside of us. These things don't always operate well. Sometimes the liver doesn't operate like it ought to, or sometimes this part of the system has an issue or a problem down the line. Do you see some of the encouragement here? David's older in life at this point, but he's looking at it and he's saying every aspect of who I am, physically, spiritually, mentally, he said, God, you designed it. I think most of us would do well to meditate on a verse like this a lot more than what we probably do. Because we spend a lot of time, our society is obsessed with it. Hopefully believers are not much so because of passages like this. But I've got to be honest, and I think if you were honest, you'd be in the same part too. There's aspects and parts of who you are physically, maybe mentally, that when you look at it, you're like, you know what, why do I have to keep dealing with this? And it's very easy to get frustrated, to get upset, to get angry with it. What we see here is the fact that David is absolutely trusting that God made him exactly like he wanted to make him. So with our flaws, with our glitches, with our bones or our organs or hair or whatever the case is. I looked away from Eric when I said that. Any aspect of it, if we truly take a passage like this to heart, it should force us to look at our own life and say, how much do I spend complaining about God's handiwork and how much do I spend praising him about his handiwork? Because there's a lot we should chew on there. Because if we're going to spend a lot of time griping and complaining, now some things physically, and I think I always throw this in when I'm in this passage, some things are consequences of our own bad choices. We got to own that. Okay? But sometimes it's not. The way we look, the shape God made us in, the looks God gave us, the haircut, whatever the case might be, that's all part of being intricately and specifically made by God. And David rejoiced in that. And we should do that too. What is even further amazing is David goes beyond the physicality of it and who he is. And we get down into verse 16. In your book were written, every one of them. He goes on, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them. Man, we can't skip that. I have no clue when my life's going to end. God does. And it's not by accident. When we look at what David says about it here, remember the context is before we were even born. Before there were any days in our life, God formed them, knew them. Has specifically ordered and put them in place already. We're 2 weeks away, and it's going to come up in a couple of weeks, from the anniversary of Mike being killed in that tree cutting accident. Still shocking to most of us. I mean, there's still days where I'm like, I can't believe this. And there's still times you're really, God? But yeah, really, God. Because God knew all along, before Mike was even born, that March 2nd, 2024 was the last day God had formed for him. We didn't know that. Man, God did. And we've got to trust in that. Because this is a wonderful, awesome, mighty God. And it's true for every one of us that way. One instance like that in an illustration sort of drives it home. But it's true for my dad and when he was going to go. It's true for any of you with parents or, God forbid, the heartache of losing a child. And what that would be like, you have to say, God knew. He numbered the days. He formed them. And folks, for you and I as believers, we've got to wrestle with that and understand the fact that that is the same God whose presence is everywhere, whose knowledge is perfect, who fearfully and wonderfully made us. And that's not just how we look, it's the days that he gives us. And it's true for every single person. That's why this passage is so amazingly powerful when it comes to some of the craziness of abortion and what our nation's doing today. You can't read these verses and not think the fact, well, the child's not born, it doesn't matter yet. It's like, how ridiculous. From that moment of conception, God has set everything into place. And our only responsibility is to have reverence and awe and respect for that. And that's not just at the beginning. What we're going to see more and more in society is that means to that last day too. And we got to be very careful not to start playing God and deciding, okay, their life is not viable anymore. It's time to let the older ones go as well and start orchestrating the final days. It is going on. I mean, there's some nations right now with some laws that are absolutely ridiculous. When they're literally passing laws, it's like, well, once they're old, they're just costing us money because we're having to care for them. So it would be better for all of society to just go ahead, and it'll always be gracefully and with dignity in their lives. They're playing God. and they're deciding when it ends. And we got to be very careful. And this is one of the foundational passages for that. How does he wrap it up here? How precious are your thoughts, O God? How vast is the sum of them. If I would count them, they are more than the sand. I awake and I'm still with you. There's nothing negative here when we look at it. David didn't know how many days God was going to give him, but he's got absolute confidence and trust in the fact that when God does it and when God has put it together, when he has not put it together haphazardly, but he has intricately formed it and made it, and when I'm saying it, our life, and the life of every single one of us, he's saying God, when he does it right. And the number of thoughts that it took to plan that intricacy, David doesn't take that lightly. He said, that's precious. Who am I that the creator of the universe would spend that much energy towards me? Because God's done it for every one of us. How precious it is. We get down to the very end. We've already looked at 19 through 22, so I'm going to skip over that. David really turns the psalm in on himself then in the last two verses. It's the basis for the hymn we sang just before the message. With this amazing knowledge of who he is, David says, search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts, and see if there be any grievous way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. When he stopped and given us this beautiful insight into his relationship with God. God, you know everything there is to know about me. God, you are everywhere. You are always with me. I can never get away from you. God, you made me. You've ordered my days. You've put me together exactly like you want to put me together. What do we see in these last couple of verses? I think it's just a beautiful aspect of David's praise, of his reverence, of his awe, of his respect for a God that has given him so much. Given him so much. Always thinking of him. Always paying attention to every little detail of his life. Never leaving him, but always being there for him. Designing him and creating him and ordering his days in the exact way he wants them to happen. David can't do anything but get to the end of that understanding of who God is and open himself up to all of that knowledge. And all of that fearful and wonderful design and creation. Why? Because David doesn't know all of his thoughts. He doesn't know all of his words. He doesn't have a clue where he's going to end the day or what it's going to look like. He doesn't know why his body operates the way it does sometimes. He doesn't know why he's got some talents and other people don't have talents, or why he was given to warfare and his son's not given to warfare. And that means God lets him do things and not. And there's so many things that David does not know about himself, but his God knows all of it. So doesn't it make sense that when he gets to the end of a psalm like this, he says, God, so search me. It's sort of interesting in the context because he's already told us God has searched him. But what is it? It's a submission of his heart. God, keep it up. God, I need you to search me. Why? Because he sees the benefit of it, because he can't search himself. Search me, know me. And God, when you see something, when I'm getting off the path, when I'm not doing it right, set me back the right way. It's a beautiful submission that David has gotten to the point in his life where he realizes how much he doesn't know, but rejoices and praises and celebrates how much his God does know. And he surrenders himself to that. There's sometimes we spend a lot of life trying to grip control, to try and do everything according to our own thoughts, our own understandings, our own perspectives. And how much more wise would it be to get to this point where David is and finally just let go of it and say, okay, God, show me. Teach me. Search me. Know my heart. Try me. Know my thoughts. And God, if I'm getting out of whack somewhere, If there's something I'm not thinking right when it comes to your knowledge of me, when it comes to your love for me, when it comes to the way you design me, when it comes to the path you're taking me down, when it comes to the fact that you're with me all the time, he said, God, if some of my thinking is grievous, if it's out of whack, help me to see it and lead me down the right way. Lead me down the right path. Help me to have that understanding. You know, each and every one of us here today, we can look at a psalm like this and it's like, man, I need that. Because it's a lifelong journey. But I hope that's our prayer. I hope it's our understanding that we can look at what David's done here. We can seek to implement it in our own life, not in a threatening way, but in a wonderfully encouraging way. That helps us have a faith and a confidence in our God that is far beyond anything we could ever manufacture in and of ourselves. And to have a faith and a confidence in our God that is so deep that even in the most difficult and trying of times or dark of times, we can still follow and do what David has said here and say, I praise you. For I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. God, you've ordered my steps. You're in control. You will hold me. You will lead me. And we rely on that, and in faith we celebrate that. Let's go ahead and have a word of prayer together, Father. Thank you so much for this psalm. It's such a beautiful piece of poetry. And Father, it's so moving because it strikes at the core of who we are. Father, it was true for David. It's true for every single one of us. There's so much of life that's a mystery to us. But God, what a wonderful, wonderful blessing to know we have a God that none of our life is a mystery to. And not just because you see all and know all, but because it's because of who you made us and how you made us and the days that you have set before us. Father, may that be a tremendous encouragement and a comfort to us. I pray that you'd be with each and every one of us as we head out here today, as we go through the course of the week. May you bring these truths back into our hearts and to our mind. And Father, may we take great encouragement in the fact that we are, because the truth of your word says it, Father, we're fearfully and wonderfully made. We can never get out of your presence. Your thoughts to us, for us, about us are so many we could never count them. And Father, may we take great joy and comfort in those truths. And we'll praise you for it in Christ's name. Amen.